Highly Intuitive People by Heidi Sawyer. Chapter 2. What is an intuitive sensitive person? Beauty of whatever kind in its supreme development invariably excites the sensitive soul to tears. Edgar Allan Poe. The term highly sensitive people was coined by Dr. Elaine Aron, an American clinical and research scientist, and it refers to a personality trait found in a section of society, an estimated 15 to 20% of the population. The basis of Dr. Aron's theory, which has attracted quite extensive scientific research in recent years, is that highly sensitive people have a nervous system that's more aware of life's subtleties because their brains process and reflect information more deeply. I got frustrated one day and threw my phone at the wall, and so now the top left corner, I can't see it because it's looks like ink spilled underneath or whatever is inside phones. But somethingologists, maybe sociologists, biologists, have found that this highly sensitive trait exists in at least 100 species, and it's considered a survival strategy. The highly sensitive animal or human is extra aware. It can see more vividly than others do, but at the same time it's easily overwhelmed. If we look at this in terms of a herd of animals, we'll see a portion who are extra observant. They feel where the best land is and where the sources of water are located, and generally know when it's time to move on. That skill is subtle, it's directive yet cautious. The rest of the herd will find themselves following the actions of these sensitive protectors who are observant enough to know when to move and when to keep still. In humans, this highly sensitive trait has been largely overlooked and sidelined, and as a result, the people who possess it feel there's something wrong with them, and their sensitivity impacts their self-esteem. Intuitive sensitivity, a form of high sensitivity. After 17 years of interacting with thousands of people who define themselves as both highly sensitive and intuitive sensitive, when I say I've, that's the author, Heidi Sawyer, come to realize that while all intuitive sensitive people are sensitives, not all sensitives are intuitive. An intuitive sensitive person shows as a refined, exaggerated type of highly sensitive person. My view of intuitive sensitivity comes from working with people who describe themselves as deeply intuitive, something they often find confusing and somewhat worrying. They're concerned about what others might, or already do, think of their apparently finely tuned instincts. Their ability to see situations for what they are, rather than what the world would like to see them as well as their inherent sensitivity. And then in italics, intuitive sensitive people tend to be the highly sensitive individuals who want to explore their sensitivity for the good of themselves and others. They want to know what their intuition is about, how to use it properly, and why they have it. And then back to the regular print. In my experience, intuitive sensitivity seems to come from an issue linked to nurturance in our early lives, which is either consciously part of our world or part of our unconscious heritage. We'll be looking at this in depth later in the book. Intuitive sensitives have, in the majority of cases, developed an additional component to their sensitivity as a layer of emotional self-protection. This quote-unquote extra part is an extra sensory skill over and above the normal senses. I've also discovered that intuitive sensitivity is a hidden trait, one that intuitive sensitives keep quiet from their outer world. Numerous professional people have confessed to me their extrasensory skills. Side note, the author is from England, so I've had doctors, barristers, I think that's like a judge or a lawyer in England, CEOs, even a university law professor tell me about their secret psychic world. But intuitive sensitivity impacts, or quote-unquote happens, to people from all walks of life. The homemaker, the accountant, the man who is afraid to tell his wife that he has extrasensory experiences. Extrasensory skills and intuitive instincts. The one thing these people have in common, though, is that their skills and instincts were not asked for. They just appeared. They often began early in childhood before promptly disappearing for a big chunk of the person's life, and then returning around the same time that other types of sensory overload became apparent. Intuitive sensitive skills show in several formats. They usually follow a process, but generally the following aspects are present. Premonitions. Firstly, there is a general feeling of seeing or knowing things before they occur. For some, this feeling is extremely obvious and psychic in nature. They see these things in their sleep state, and they have a relaxed insight into people's lives, an ability to see outcomes beyond you'll meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger, and predicting lottery numbers. It's more to do with an insight into other people and how they feel. This will often relate to relationships, work scenarios, and anything to do with danger. The insight often occurs in a spontaneous manner. Many intuitive sensitives have very vivid experiences of feeling another's energy, their life situation, and the outcome to what may be creating upset. Sometimes this insight isn't popular with their nearest and dearest, who see it as quote-unquote doom thinking or meddling. Therefore, I see quite a few upset intuitive sensitives who can't get through to the people they love. In the early days, intuitive sensitives find this inability to get through very distressing because they feel it's their job to help solve or rescue. This sensitivity to seeing things in their dream or waking state before they manifest in reality causes many a moral dilemma. They ask themselves, should I or shouldn't I speak up? Often it's a thankless task, mentioning things that someone hasn't asked for, and this starts to impact the intuitive sensitive self-esteem. Their insights are often ignored or discounted, but then they discover months later that what they predicted has in fact happened. But how did they know it? Is it some kind of magical ability? Is it really possible to predict an outcome when you have little to no information? Many theorize that intuitive instincts beyond the norms of human behavior are a fallacy of the deluded. This belief upsets and confuses the true intuitive sensitive because their deepest nature, something they can't help or stop themselves from being part of, is marginalized and made unacceptable. They go on to question whether their perceptive instincts are indeed the result of an overproductive imagination or even a serious mental health issue. I always reassure those who question their sanity that insane people don't notice they're not quite right. They tend to believe there's nothing wrong with them, it's everyone else. The intuitive sensitive, however, believes that everyone else is right and there's something wrong with them. As they're very sensitive to energy, they see things before they occur, are very perceptive when it comes to other people, don't suffer fools, are hypervigilant, and can't be bothered with polite conversations about the weather. They want to get to the juicy stuff or not bother at all. And then in italics, intuitive sensitives take 2 seconds flat to decide if they like or dislike someone. That decision isn't based on looks, how someone appears, or the persona they present. It's placed on what they quote-unquote feel, all of which does appear on the surface to put them in the land of la-la, hence the reason they sometimes question their sanity. And then back to unitalics, regular writing. This is especially difficult because our social programming has trained us to be polite, to put others first, and never to express how we really feel. This builds an enormous pressure in the intuitive sensitive, especially as most have a paralyzing fear of confrontation. This isn't usually because they're scared or nervous people, although as it affects people from all walks of life, some are. It's because confrontation actually physically hurts them. They have to deal with their own sensory information around the confrontation and also process the emotions of the other person. If that emotion is anger, it'll cut into something deep in their stomach region, way beyond butterflies. If it's hurt, then they feel enormous guilt for bringing it up and upsetting the other person. For the intuitive sensitive, confrontation is about bracing yourself, preparing for the energetic onslaught. Sensory overload. In seminar presentations, when I explain why an intuitive sensitive person will do a quote-unquote perfume dash through a department store, or why, when visiting a restaurant, they'd rather leave than have to sit at a table with their back to the door, or how at a dinner party they'll hang around to make sure they get the end seat on a rectangular table, but don't mind where they sit on a round table, there's always a deep chuckle of recognition. But why do they do these things? The answer is information overload. To an intuitive sensitive, the perfume counter smells like a chemical factory designed to give them a headache. When people dine out in a restaurant, they expect to be able to relax and enjoy their meal. But for the intuitive sensitive who finds themselves seated with their back to the door, it's anything but relaxing. The diners coming into the restaurant have questions in their minds. Where will they sit? Where are their friends they're due to meet? And then there are the nervous ones on a first date. All this information is picked up by the intuitive sensitive's awareness, although they haven't even seen these people. It makes them feel vulnerable, exposed to others' emotions when they don't want to be. They want to eat in peace. They aren't aware of this in the early days. Then all they know is that their general feelings switch every few minutes while they're eating. When they can seat themselves facing the door, though, it seems they're more in control of how they feel, not so caught unawares. And why the rectangular table? Intuitive sensitives discover that the people in a group who like to be in control, or who are particularly nervous, will head towards a central seat. Those people will be worrying about what they'll order and how the bill will be split, and the intuitive sensitive doesn't want to be processing all of that. They've gone out to interact with their friends, not to be in the unconscious firing line of a stranger's mind. They feel so much better sitting at the end of the table with just one person on one side whose energy they have to deal with, and usually the other sensitive person opposite them. They have plenty to discuss with these people beyond the weather and polite chit-chat. The conversation turns to deeper matters in a short space of time, while the socially anxious are desperate to clamber to the central seats to have competitive conversations with plenty of nervous laughter. They avoid the quote-unquote deep people at the end, whom they often initially mistake as shy. Intuitive sensitivity and wisdom. Strongly perceptive wisdom is a part of the intuitive sensitive's makeup, and it's often been present since their early years. Often mistaken as shy in childhood, the intuitive sensitive person was busy working out how others view the world, and it wasn't long before they realized others don't seem to share their values. For some, this led to a feeling of emotional isolation, as their overly responsible nature sought to look after others before they were mature enough to do so. Many were called mini adults or wise babies, but without the precocious attitude. Theirs is a quiet, subtle level of natural wisdom. Later in life, as the intuitive sensitive tries to shrug off this wisdom, they often have to make compromised decisions in order to fit in. This is part of their tendency to want to, quote-unquote, save others, to avoid like the plague any kind of judgment, and feel safe and loved. This compromised self survives into adulthood, especially if they've come from a background that taught them to value what others think over and above their own perceptions. It's not until the shame, guilt, and sense of duty is really felt that the intuitive sense starts to really knock on their inner door. The question is, why do intuitive sensitives suddenly become aware of their deeper senses? I believe the brain triggers this awareness as a strong survival instinct, so the already intuitive sensitive person who has stepped up a gear once too often can protect themselves from an emotional breakdown when their overwhelmed senses become too much to bear. The quote-unquote switch happens when the intuitive sensitive has had enough of feeling pushed from pillar to post. It's an unconscious trigger that gradually becomes conscious. Stress and the intuitive sensitive. Stress is a normal, everyday occurrence for an intuitive sensitive, just as it is for most people. The difference is that many intuitive sensitives are great in a crisis. They're the ones who don't panic, the ones who seem to know almost instantly what to do. Their nervous system doesn't shut down when difficulty strikes. In fact, it comes to life. To them, this kind of external stress is almost a pleasurable relief from the internal stress they live with constantly. There are many aspects of the highly sensitive person that cross into the intuitive sensitive person. The intuitive sensitive swims in the pool of life like everyone else, but while others respond with something gentle or subtle breaststroke in warm, sometimes cool waters, they find themselves flapping at a manic pace with all kinds of stuff wrapped around their feet. Sometimes it's seaweed, sometimes it's an unusual fish trying to nibble their feet. At other times, they see the shark coming while everyone else is oblivious or slow to react. The trouble is that intuitive sensitives have a vivid mind. Everyone I've ever met had a very alert, elaborate memory. They remember fine detail, usually associated with emotional impact. On the one hand, this is incredibly useful, but on the other, it means they don't forget. Their entire nervous system is run by ongoing memory. It pipes up, "Don't put your foot there. Remember the last time you did that? We got covered in seaweed for weeks. Oh, and remember that shift in the feel of things before the shark came? Watch what you do there and dodge the spot where it was icy cold last time." This kind of ongoing internal pressure would turn most people into a neurotic mess. The intuitive sensitive, however, has learned how to negotiate their internal minefield, so it often appears completely, quote-unquote, handled in their external world. That's not to say they put on a performance. In fact, it's usually the complete opposite. They need honesty. Why? Well, it's tough enough looking out for everything in the pool of life without having to deal with others' denial and panic over the seaweed they've never experienced before. A lack of honesty is what really creates a deep stress in the intuitive sensitive. This is because their empathetic nature feels highly responsible for the emotions others cannot access. Their refined senses mean they're constantly interpreting energy. They just can't help it. They walk into a situation and live out the energy of it. They feel it in work environments, within a room, even in a new house purchase. And then in italics. Yet, although they experience a continuous sensory overload, intuitive sensitives aren't emotional heaps who are unable to function in life. They are made of tough stuff. They get up, dust themselves down, and carry on. They can do this because of the development of faith. Back to regular type on italics. This faith appears through an internal instinct rather than being triggered by an external event or interest. I believe it's an emotional survival drive for the intuitive sensitive to feel they want to develop their intuitive instincts. to help them successfully weave through the fires of life with only the occasional burn. It may have taken a while for them to become aware they have these intuitive skills, as they regard them as normal and believe that everyone has them. Their interest returns to them later in life, despite the fact they tried to abandon it in childhood. The feeling of, quote-unquote, going home. Every intuitive sensitive I've come across has had a feeling inside of, quote, wanting to go home, end quote. When I've discussed this observation with an audience, tears stream down people's faces. They fidget and they look around. They're not quite sure what to do with themselves. The reason for this is that again, I can't see the top left part of my phone. This sense of wanting to go home. They thought the sense of wanting to go home was something quiet, a feeling no one else acknowledged. They believed it was only them who felt it. For intuitive sensitives, home doesn't have a name. It isn't a place they understand. It's not a house or a location to move to. It's a feeling they recognize somewhere deep inside. They've had some kind of experience that has given them a glimpse of this feeling, and it's one they are keen to return to. To an intuitive sensitive, the feeling of home is a strong motivator in life. In fact, I'd say it's their main focus. They want and are willing to create the feeling of their life experience. They want to live rather than to exist. Their sensory perceptions, their intuition-based focus is something they want to use positively in the physical world. Their desire for meaning, purpose, and acceptance is strong enough to drive them to make a real difference, even if they're scared. They need and want, though, to let go of worrying about what others think. They need to figure out how to manage risk and neutralize their own misjudgments or wishful thinking. The feeling of home offers this safety from the fear of criticism and a release from the pressure of perfection, although it's their perfectionist nature that contributes to their empathetic gentleness. In a world where logic is valued more highly than emotion, the feeling of home, however briefly felt at some point in an intuitive sensitive's life, has a strong foundation in their intuitive nature. The word intuition comes from a Latin verb meaning to look inside, to internalize contemplation. To the intuitive sensitive, the experience of returning home is a feeling where the world of the personality or logic collides with the world of emotion. The true self. Intuition generally provides views or judgments that cannot be empirically verified, and this makes proving intuitional processes very difficult, especially here in the West where, quote-unquote, logic is king. The intuitive sensitive person worries whether their intuitive self is true rather than just a figment of their overproductive imagination, and most importantly, they are concerned that it's not the basis of making them somehow, quote-unquote, fake. This internalized pressure creates an emotional division between the logical self and the basis of the soul's process, which is based on an honesty of emotion, a component of top left part of my phone, something often referred to as the true self. So what is the true self? Has anyone ever seen this elusive creature? Are we not simply made up of our brain's function? And isn't the true self something made up concept, fluffy made up concept? There's plenty of very convincing evidence to suggest that the former is true. However, I believe even if we're simply our brain, the intelligence that tells us how to proceed, how to make the brain work must and does come from a universal intelligence. That universal intelligence is based in intuition. It's the link to the unconfined, the untrainable, the level of energy that has a mind and intelligence of its own. It won't be controlled or manipulated. The true self, therefore, is free-flowing. It has a mind of its own, and it enjoys its freedom. We experience ourselves as the true self the moment we let go of trying to control outcomes. What the intuitive sensitive wants in life is to find a level of self-acceptance. Chapter 3. You're too sensitive. A quote, "You go through spells where you feel that maybe you're too sensitive for this world. I certainly felt that." Winona Ryder. Andrea arrived home from work, kicked off her shoes, and headed straight for the fridge. She opened the door and looked longingly inside for the remains of the chocolate bar she'd carefully hidden in the fridge door the previous night. She'd had a bad day. A colleague had joked about the quality of her work because she'd made a minor mistake. She never made mistakes, and her colleague had been quick to point this one out. She was sure he hadn't meant any harm, but even so, the comment had hurt her. Andrea peeled off what was left of the wrapper and, breaking one of the last 4 squares with her teeth, slashed the silky smooth chocolate around her mouth. Instantly, she felt calm. She then switched on the TV and sat quietly, mindlessly gazing at the screen as she enjoyed her few moments of peace before anyone else came home. And then in italics, intuitive, sensitive people strongly question things. They question the meaning of life right down to where they fit in, and this is something they've experienced for a very long time. They can't cope with the mundane. It's painful for them, and they want to be part of something with meaning. More importantly, they want deep connection. Then back to regular type, no italics. When others joke about them or criticize them, the energy of such things cuts a very deep wound. They may take it lightly on the surface, but underneath they're plotting to leave that situation as quickly as they possibly can. I'm sure most people have a sensitivity, criticism. After all, I think it's supposed to be, we want to be liked, and we don't like to offend others. We prefer to keep the peace. In this way, many events in life are overlooked and ignored. People just don't want to get involved. But the intuitive sensitive is caught in a world where criticism is a distinct fear. They will go to great lengths to avoid it unless the situation involves someone who means a lot to them, in which case they'll defend themselves to the hilt, but always try hard to make sure their response is fair and just. The way that they deal with criticism keeps them awake at night. Should they or shouldn't they do it? How do they approach it? What will be the consequences? The chocolate criticism connection. For the intuitive sensitive, criticism brings up such a feeling of deep anxiety. It not only impacts their feelings, it also impacts how they interact with food. In my experience, those individuals who have had a particularly powerful early life experience around criticism, an overly critical parent, for example, will be strongly attracted to chocolate. Why chocolate? Serotonin, the happy brain chemical that lowers the stress response, has long been a partner with chocolate. On occasion, I've experimented with groups of intuitive people during workshops, dividing them into groups according to their favorite sugar item. For some, it's cakes, others biscuits, and of course, for many, it's chocolate. I found that certain emotions are a strong match for these groups. For the chocolate people, it's criticism. They eat chocolate in a secretive manner. They try to make sure that people, even themselves, don't notice how much of it they eat. The group, when presented with copious amounts of chocolate and the permission to eat it, politely refuse. Some break off 4 squares, nibble on them, then neatly fold the top and go no further. The others won't even touch the chocolate, claiming they don't want or need it. In public, their emotions wouldn't allow them to eat chocolate or even acknowledge that they wanted it. Their story was very different when I then took the chocolate away, putting it straight into a waste sack. Then they were scrambling to try and save it, angry that it was going to waste. It was at this point that their true emotions emerged. They were secretive because they feared criticism for eating the chocolate. Yet a strong anger and enraged rebellion made them want to eat it in private. When I asked these people about their behavior afterwards, side note, I don't remember her describing it as enraged rebellion. And also, she spelled serotonin, serotonin. I thought sereto. I feel like she spelled serotonin wrong a few pages back, but anyway. When I asked these people about their, about their behavior afterwards, each one said that they had indeed had at least one highly critical parent. This isn't to say that all chocoholics have a critical parent. However, every intuitive, sensitive person I've met whose favorite source of sugar is chocolate has experienced this, and there's too much evidence from thousands of people to dismiss this. These individuals' highly intuitive instincts have emerged as some form of defense or protection mechanism. It's become an ability to protect and ward off criticism by being able to accurately judge or prejudge or even accurately pre-see situations. Attachment and an inherited fear of criticism. Humiliation, worrying about what others think, and displays of anger or shouting are areas of deep concern for the intuitive sensitive person working out their level of sensitivity. It also impacts in terms of their deepest fear, humiliation. These things hold back the intuitive sensitive in all areas of their life. They prevent them from speaking up, engaging in certain activities, or voicing their irritation before the point of outrage. Something we learned in the last chapter, there's a strong indication that natural sensitivity is a trait you're born with. It isn't dependent on being intuitive, although sensitives do notice more. In fact, some would say noticing more is the only basis of intuitive instinct. But I believe intuitive sensitives have something deeper. This depth, the link to spiritual matters. For some, it's the link to God. To others, it's spiritual experiences, healing, psychic insight, interpreting energy, or Buddhist principles. Comes from a subconscious need to experience a deeper connection to love. Attachment theory is a psychological theory that has gained enormous ground over the last few decades. Originating from the work of psychoanalyst John Bowlby, it's centered on the emotional bonds between people, and it suggests that the earliest of these bonds, or lack of them, can leave a lasting impression on our lives. Says that humans need to form a deep relationship with their primary caregiver in early life for successful social and emotional development to take place. This relationship or bond is also believed to be crucial for our ability to self-regulate our feelings. Personally, I've noticed a big change in how this area is approached around childbirth. When my eldest son was born in 2004, the maternity department strongly encouraged us new mothers to make skin-to-skin contact as soon as it was safely possible. Then, this top left screen of my phone, I can't see. After as complicated a delivery as mine had been. By 2011, when my youngest was born, the skin-to-skin contact was obligatory, even though on that occasion I was barely functioning. The reason given was the need to build the baby's immune system, but really attachment is a lot more than that. Anyone born in many parts of the Western world during the 1960s, 70s, and perhaps part of the 80s was separated from their mother and placed in a nursery shortly after birth. Having been safe and comfortable swimming around in the womb, life was suddenly sprung upon us. We were separated from our original source of comfort, the scent of our mother, the sound of her voice, our familiar albeit muffled surroundings during our 9 months in the womb. These all abruptly concluded with no contact with mom, set feeding times, and the sound of other screaming babies. During these decades, little thought was given to the baby and its developing brain, and as products of the, quote, children should be seen and not heard era, those of us born in this era have quietly accepted this very early level of compromise. Then in italics, perhaps one of the reasons why so many children born today are more bold and forthcoming in their views and confidence is because they arrived during a time when immediate human contact after birth was encouraged, thus ensuring their nervous systems had a firmer foundation. Then on italics, regular typing. Go back. On top left, I can't see what words. Go back further. Those born in Europe and elsewhere during the 1940s and 50s have the remnants of World War II as part of their psyche, and the generations before them were born into a time of deep distress. I can't see what the word is. The horrors of World War I and its aftermath. In those eras, infant attachment and early foundations were not top of the agenda. I should say not at the top of the agenda, but it doesn't. This energy has filtered down through the generations. Certainly in the UK, we still have that wartime keep calm and carry on mentality. This isn't helpful to the intuitive, sensitive individual who feels the undertones of others' feelings as though they are their own, yet on the surface will deny their emotions as though their life depends on it. The denial of emotions leads to insecurity hidden as power, and when this happens, it comes out in another person as criticism. Intuitive, sensitive people who were heavily criticized by a parent or parents weren't able to brush off that criticism. It cuts very deeply, more so than was intended. Also, if they didn't form a strong early bond with that parent, if the attachment wasn't deep enough, it left an emotional space, one that they later filled with the unconscious belief that in order to be loved, attached, I must be criticized. That belief can filter into their adult relationships. They'll always be waiting with trepidation to be criticized. If this doesn't show in their outer relationships, it'll certainly show internally with the self. They will become their own worst critic. If an intuitive sensitive has experienced a critical parent, it's often the case that the parent had a tough start in life themselves. There may have been attachment issues during their formative years. Perhaps their parents abandoned them emotionally, and this may have led them to believe that their sensitive child needs to, quote-unquote, toughen up. Perhaps presenting them with the cold, hard facts of life, which they too had to face, will do the job. For the intuitive sensitive then, along with criticism, emotional abandonment also becomes strongly associated with love. There's often an unconscious belief that they need to remain emotionally distant and be incredibly self-sufficient, even though they're sensitive, because at some point the people they become close to will leave them. There's a point in time when the sensitive mind wants to evolve beyond defining the self as someone who deserves criticism. It appears that this unconscious desire triggers the unfolding of the intuitive process. The person begins to switch into seeing life through the eyes of intuition and a deeper connection with the self. Why does this happen? Seemingly, it's a stage at which the psyche, the unconscious world of the person, wants to have a connection to unconditional love. This is a love that the person has never felt from another. It's a soul love, something beyond words, but it's deeply and I can't see the word. It's on the top left side of my screen. It somehow replaces the quote-unquote lost love of insecure attachment, I guess deeply connected. This is often the beginning of switching from being sensitive into becoming an intuitive sensitive. For some, the connection to unconditional love begins with an attraction or belief in angels. For others, it's an experience of psychic insight through dreams or feeling guided. Whatever the experience, the opening of intuitive insight and unconsciously working with it develops a sense of security and relief from what is for some depressed feelings or anxiety. This isn't to say that all highly intuitive people have experienced parental criticism or emotional abandonment. Your own parents may have been ultra kind to compensate for what they lacked in their early life. However, it's likely that you've come from generations of them, or at the very least, from the era of infant emotional abandonment. The cool facts are that this poor early start has impacted generations going forwards, and it suggests why you were born so sensitive. I don't remember that part of this book. Intuitive sensitives and autoimmune disease. Recently, I conducted a survey among a group of people who define themselves as highly intuitive to see if there was a possible connection between that and the incidence of autoimmune disease. Parentheses, I did this mostly out of interest because I wanted to see if the link was my imagination or a definable trait. Close parentheses. I enlisted the help of a medical doctor and more than 2,000 highly intuitive people completed the survey. The results were analyzed and they showed a rate of autoimmune-related health issues 30% higher than the national average, but the question is why? Clinical research shows that chronic stress can impair the body's immunity. Studies have shown that attachment insecurity, characterized by difficulty trusting others, worrying about being abandoned, and feeling uncomfortable with emotional intimacy, can impact the quote-unquote killer cells that defend our body against illness. This suggests that early attachment issues can impact adult attachment issues, parentheses, how we relate/trust in romantic relationships, especially once we've been hurt, close parentheses, and can go on to impact our health. Childhood trauma has been linked to heightened risk of serious disease, including autoimmune disorders. In some circumstances, people with autoimmune diseases have an abnormal range of cortisol levels. Cortisol is a hormone made in the cortex of the adrenal glands, then released into the blood. Almost every cell in the body contains receptors for cortisol, including those that control the body's blood sugar levels and therefore the regulation of our metabolism. Cortisol acts as an anti-inflammatory. It influences our memory, and it controls our body's water and salt levels. In addition, it's responsible for the way the body deals with stress. Many intuitive sensitives, regardless of whether or not they have autoimmune issues, state that they have symptoms associated with stressed adrenal glands. The adrenals having become tired from the pressure of producing high levels of cortisol. They have a heavy interest in sugar, central abdominal fat, parentheses, even if they're generally slim, close parentheses, intense fatigue, and signs of inflammation. Many of these symptoms are also called stress. Given that in order to be intuitive, you have a higher than average nervous system response to stimuli, stress will be your middle name. Then in italics. For some intuitive sensitives, the extra pressure on their system may result in an autoimmune condition called chronic fatigue syndrome. I've seen that for many of these people, the stress response of chronic fatigue is a part of their internal world, perhaps even the inner child calling out for nurturance. Then back to regular type on italics. At an unconscious level, the child self feels that the emotional world is too overwhelming for them to process. The resulting stress means the cortisol receptors in the body flood and stop working properly because this quote-unquote overwhelm is too strong for them. This This process is a little like the conveyor belt at the end of a supermarket checkout. How frustrated we get if the person operating the till is in too much of a hurry to turn the belt off and give us a chance to pack our shopping before it gets crushed. With chronic fatigue, the